Moscow, 1937. The room is 4 meters by 4 meters, stone floor, one wooden chair bolted to the center, a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, aimed directly downward so that the light hits the chair and nowhere else. The walls are close enough that a man sitting in the chair can see them clearly, far enough that he cannot touch them without standing up. There is no window, there is no clock, the door has no handle on the inside. The room has no chains, no instruments, no guards standing over you. And for the men who sat in that chair, every single one of them, that absence was the most terrifying thing they had ever encountered in their lives. This is not a story about physical force. The Soviet NKVD had plenty of that. This is a story about something far more sophisticated, something that a colonel named Dmitry Nazarov had spent 11 years designing in the margins of official reports, something that by 1937 had a quiet internal name that nobody used in writing and everybody understood in practice. They called it the Conveyor. And once you understand how it worked, you will never think about silence the same way again. Professor Ivan Volkov was 44 years old on the morning of November 3, 1937. He taught classical literature at Moscow State University. He had a wife named Mira, a daughter in secondary school, and a small apartment near the university that smelled of old books and boiled cabbage. He had, as far as he could determine, done absolutely nothing wrong. He was arrested at 6 in the morning, not dramatically. 2 men in civilian clothing knocked on the door. They showed identification. They asked him to come with them for a conversation. They told him he would be home by evening. Mira stood in the doorway in her housecoat, holding a cup of tea that she had made for Ivan before the knock came, and she watched him put on his coat and follow the 2 men down the stairs. She waited by the window until dark. Then she made dinner and left it on the table. She did not eat. She did not sleep. She sat in the chair nearest the door, and she waited. Ivan was not home by evening. Ivan was not home by the following evening. Ivan Volkov would not see his apartment, his books, or his wife for 11 days. But nobody told Mira that. Nobody told Mira anything. She was simply left to sit in the chair by the door, waiting, without information, without explanation, without any way of knowing whether her husband was being questioned or had been sentenced or was already gone. The uncertainty, deliberately manufactured, was not incidental to the process. It was the second instrument. The Mira was part of the interrogation without ever entering a room. This is the first thing Colonel Nazarov had understood that nobody before him had fully articulated in writing. The person sitting in the chair is not the only subject. Everyone connected to them, wife, colleague, neighbor, is simultaneously under pressure the moment the door closes. The arrested person knows this. They sit in the chair thinking not only about themselves, but about every person who is now waiting for them. And that secondary layer of pressure, invisible and untouchable, is in some ways more powerful than anything done directly. Nazarov had written in one of his private notes, never officially submitted, "A man can endure considerable direct pressure if he believes he is protecting only himself. Remove that condition and the calculation changes entirely." Major Alexei Petrov was 31 years old and had been working the Conveyor for 3 years. He was not a cruel man in the way the word is usually applied. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He spoke in a measured, almost academic tone that several subjects had later described, in the rare cases where they were eventually released and their accounts were recorded, as the most unsettling thing about the entire experience. Not the room, not the sleeplessness, the calmness of the man across the table. Petrov entered Volkov's room at 2 in the morning on the first night. Volkov had been sitting in the chair for approximately 20 hours by this point. He had been given water twice, no food, no explanation of why he was there or what was expected of him, just the chair, the light, the walls, and the door with no handle. Petrov sat down across from him. He placed a folder on the table. He did not open it. He looked at Volkov for a long moment, and then he said, very quietly, "Tell me about your work." That was all. Not, "You are accused of," not, "We have evidence that," not a single specific allegation, just, "Tell me about your work." Volkov talked about his work. He talked for 40 minutes because talking felt better than silence, and because he had no idea what else to do. When he finished, Petrov looked at the folder again, still did not open it. He said, "Thank you," stood up, and left the room. The light stayed on, the door closed, and Volkov sat alone in the chair trying to understand what had just happened. This is the mechanism the Conveyor used that made it categorically different from every interrogation method that relied on direct pressure. It gave the subject nothing to push against. When a man is threatened, he can orient himself towards the threat. He can build resistance. He can locate his courage relative to the specific thing he is afraid of. But when nothing specific is said, when a calm man sits across from you, asks a general question, nods, thanks you, and leaves, there is nothing to push against. The mind, deprived of a specific target for its anxiety, turns inward and begins generating its own threats, things the interrogator never said, implications that were never made, connections between innocent facts that the subject begins constructing entirely on his own, in the silence, under the unchanging light. Petrov knew this. He had watched it happen dozens of times. The Conveyor's true mechanism was not the interrogator, it was the subject's own mind left alone long enough, with enough silence, generating a confession that no interrogator had ever requested. 3 hours after Petrov left, another officer entered. Different face, same calm tone, different question. "Tell me about your colleagues." Volkov talked for 30 minutes. The officer nodded, said nothing substantive, and left. 1 hour later, Petrov returned, as if no time had passed. "You mentioned a colleague named Rubinstein earlier. Tell me more about him." Volkov had not mentioned Rubinstein. He was almost certain he had not mentioned Rubinstein. He said so. Petrov looked at the folder, said, "Perhaps I am misremembering," smiled slightly, left. Volkov sat in the chair staring at the door and trying to remember every word he had said since entering the room. He could not remember all of it. He had been awake for 26 hours and the light had never changed, and there was no clock, and he could not tell if it was day or night outside the walls, and his mind was beginning to do something he didn't have a word for. It was beginning to audit itself, reviewing every conversation he had ever had with every colleague, searching for the thing they already knew, for the shape of the accusation that had not yet been spoken. The Conveyor worked in rotating shifts. While Volkov sat, the interrogators slept, rested, ate meals, changed shifts like workers at a factory, while the subject remained in the chair because nobody had told him he could stand, nobody had told him he could sleep, the instructions had simply never been given, the interrogators were fresh, alert, calm, and Volkov was not. By the third day, Volkov was experiencing something that sleep researchers would now identify as sleep deprivation psychosis, not from drugs, not from any deliberate chemical intervention, simply from the light that never changed, the silence that never resolved into explanation, and the uncertainty about whether the folder on the table contained evidence of something he had done or evidence of something he had not done, which in some ways was worse, because if you have done nothing, you cannot confess to the specific thing, and you cannot make it stop. Colonel Nazarov had understood this with considerable precision. In his private notes he wrote, "The innocent subject is more vulnerable than the guilty one. The guilty man knows what the folder contains. The innocent man does not. He must consider therefore every possibility, and every possibility is more frightening than any specific truth." On the 7th day, Petrov sat across from Volkov and placed a single sheet of paper on the table. He slid it across. He said, "This is a summary of what we have discussed this week. I would like you to confirm that it is accurate." Volkov picked it up. His hands were shaking in a way they had not shaken before this week. He read it. It was not inaccurate exactly. It was a selection. Certain names mentioned in passing, elevated. certain casual observations about colleagues reframed as assessments, nothing that Volkov had not technically said, arranged in a way that implied something he had not meant. He looked at Petrov. Petrov looked back at him without expression, and Volkov understood with the specific clarity that comes only after 7 days of fluorescent light and rotating questioners and no information, that the document was not a summary of what he had said, it was a portrait of what they wanted him to have said. And the question of whether he signed it depended entirely on whether he still believed, after 7 days, that the truth was something the room was interested in. Now, here is the detail that stays with me. Of the men who sat in the conveyor between 1936 and 1938 and the historical records that survived, partial and heavily redacted, suggest the number was in the thousands, a substantial portion signed documents they knew to be false, not because they were weak, not because they lacked courage, but because the system had been specifically engineered to make the concept of resistance feel not brave, but simply pointless. To sit in a chair under a light with a calm man asking reasonable questions is not a scenario the human nervous system is built to identify as an emergency. There is no adrenaline, there is no clear threat to orient toward. There is only the slow, grinding erosion of the boundary between what you know and what you are no longer sure of. Volkov signed on the 9th day. He was released on the 11th. He walked home to his apartment. Mira was in the chair by the door. She stood up. He sat down. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know what I said." And Mira, who had sat by the door for 11 days without information, who had been the second instrument in an interrogation she never knew she was part of, said nothing either, because there was nothing useful to say, because the system had not needed either of them to understand it in order to work. Here is what the conveyor was actually hiding under its calm, its silence, its absence of anything visibly cruel. It was hiding the most sophisticated understanding of human psychology that any state apparatus had ever put into institutional practice, that the mind, denied sleep, denied information, denied a specific accusation to resist, will eventually generate its own prison, that the most effective way to break a person is not to attack them, but to remove every reference point they use to know who they are. That silence applied with precision over enough time in a room with no clock and no handle on the door does something that no direct force has ever reliably accomplished. It makes a person a stranger to themselves. That knowledge did not disappear when the Soviet Union ended. It did not go into a museum. The psychological principles that Colonel Nazarov worked out in the margins of his reports, the effects of uncertainty, of manufactured isolation, of the rotating calm voice, and the document that is not quite wrong, these have been studied, documented, and argued about in international courts and military ethics committees and academic psychology departments from 1945 to the present day, under different names, in different rooms, with different paperwork. The chair is still in the room, the light is still on, and somewhere a very calm man is asking a very reasonable question and waiting to see what the silence produces. If that line landed somewhere uncomfortable, good, drop a comment. Tell me which moment in this story stayed with you longest, and tell me where in the world you are watching this from. Because this channel exists for people who want to understand history as it actually operated, not the version that gets cleaned up and filed away. See you in the next one.